Aujourd'hui, je vais parler de one of those eternal questions that no matter which side of the fence you're on, you're usually pretty certain that you're the one that's got it right. And that's all about dividend investing. Hey, XenPuck here. Since I spent a lot of time watching personal finance and or investing videos, it's pretty clear there's a camp of people who really love dividend investing, and another counter camp who's constantly shouting, "Dividends don't matter," as if it's some sort of religious mantra. I mean, personally, I love watching people argue, but not as much as I love hearing myself argue. So today, I'm just going to solve this argument because, I mean, obviously, I'm a genius and all that. So stay tuned to find out who is right. Is dividends the best way to get income, or just a fake way to hide company weakness, or something more insidious or magnificent? Oh boy, I just promised a lot, and immediately I have to preface this rant with, believe me if you want or not, I'm just a single point of anecdotal evidence. But I do have plenty of personal experience with what I'm talking about, so subscribe, like, comment, share, or any of the other social media nonsense word that will be made up soon, like Kartoffelkopf or whatever, since I'm sure you are a smarter person than me, obviously. So number one, when it comes to dividend investing, I can't emphasize this enough, which is do not go chase dividend yields, all right? At least don't go chase any stock just for the yield. Good Lord, that is like the most rookie mistake any investor in the stock market can make, okay? I know this because I've done it myself, right? Because it's fun to imagine living off dividends, and it's much easier to imagine that if you can find some stocks that yield, say, north of 10%. Amazing, right? No, because basically yield is a function of price. And if you look at the history of the prices of any stocks that yields more than 10%, usually the yield is only high because the price history is going exactly the wrong direction that you'd like, right? Who cares if you get a high yield rate if the underlying value of your investment is trending towards zero, right? So don't be fooled. There's absolutely there's absolutely a reason why the most reputable dividend yield funds only yield somewhere definitely less than 5%, right? And that is usually the funds that they call the most aggressive, right? Because, anyway, there are some exceptions in the group that I'm talking about that has high yields, such as MLPs, but that can be its own topic for another day, right? But generally, if you look at the broad market, high yield over 5% is almost never a reliable type of rate. Okay. Now I'm gonna get into the pros and cons, right? Pros of living off dividends, right? People who want to live off of dividends, actually, to me, it really sounds a lot like people who want to live off of rental income, right? Like if they buy a bunch of single-family homes. I think the appeal is obviously very apparent, right? You sit on a stash of assets, you don't have to sell any of it, and instead you just get paid on the regular. Heck, income from dividends in general is actually more stable and less actual work than even rental properties, right? The difference, of course, is that all stocks are more volatile in the short term than real estate. And to be honest, real estate, you can use leverage, right? You can do that on stocks, but I wouldn't recommend it, right? But being a landlord, there are other extra costs, such as, depreciation, repairs, maintenance, and all that, right? I'd say dividend investors tend to actually forget that dividend stocks themselves actually are always depreciating, okay? Every single time they give off dividends, right? The underlying value of the company sheds whatever amount the dividend payout actually is, right? But because stocks in the long term do tend to trend upwards, higher than any other realistic assets most people have access to, the drop due to the dividend yield at any quarter or monthly period, they will be covered by the slow and hopefully steady increase in the stock value itself, right? For those of us with a longer horizon than just a few years to retirement, of course, doing dividend growth investing is actually quite helpful, because if you're constantly reinvesting in dividends, right? Think about it. If you look at some studies, it's no lie that the great percentage of the growth in the S&P 500 over the last 50 to 100 years is actually from dividend reinvestments, right? Because after a few decades, even if you started off with a yield that's only 1.5% to 2% before, if you've been reinvesting that same profit, meaning that you're not putting in any more additional money, okay, the effective yield would have compounded. So after 20, 30 years, your effective yield would look absolutely amazing, right? It's gonna trend towards the double digits, believe me. Now, let's talk about cons, right? Living off of dividends. I mean, the reality is that you're always shedding off income that you cannot control, right? Dividends simply implies a lack of imagination from the company's point of view as to what they should do with their own money, okay? Look, if it's a mature company, a large blue chip like Coca-Cola, or especially monopolistic companies like utilities companies, like energy companies in the United States, that's totally fine, right? But even then, there are some major exceptions, such as Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, right? If you think about Berkshire Hathaway, it seems like a blue chip, you know, hold everything. He doesn't really invest in anything super risky. That's true, so you think of it as a blue chip company. But that's because the man who runs the fund, that's Warren Buffett, he buys plenty of companies that actually gives off dividends, and yet this giant combo stock that is Berkshire Hathaway does not shed dividends. Why? Because the main investor, Buffett, he thinks he can better use the money to grow the business, right, with that money, rather than using it to incentivize investors to hold his stock. The funny thing, of course, is that I think almost anyone who would ever buy Berkshire stock holds it for the long run, because at this point, Berkshire stock is legendary for its long-term track record, right? The main point here is that dividends aren't some magical cure that some companies can give out and others cannot, right? And the best, most innovative companies, or newest companies, don't actually need to tempt investors with this type of steady income incentive at all. After all, you can always just sell shares of money, right? And the difference between that and dividend income is that you can control how much you actually need. Therefore, better control your tax exposure, right? Especially if you're on the richer end of the scale, right? Yet, before I sound too negative, the reality is that most people who invested long-term into stocks, it implies that they have a certain level of patience and a lack of knee-jerk reactionary, you know, kind of incentive or abilities, right? So maybe they're a buy and hold forever type of guy like me, in which case decision points on when or how much to sell, well, that might just not be a thing that I'm interested in at a regular basis. So, you know, to be honest, this con is a bit of a wash in terms of personal preference, right? So at the end of the day, what is actually my conclusion? Do dividends matter, or what do I do personally? Well, I've admitted that at some point a few years ago, I did want explicit income, especially when I was about to lose that sweet tech company regular paycheck, right? But over time, I've realized that, well, I do like some level of guaranteed income. It almost always only really needs to cover my bare basic necessities, right? These days, instead of chasing any yields of more than, say, 5%, I'd rather, you know, chase current yields that are much lower. After all, once I've covered my lean necessities, I can be the one that decides on how much else to fund my luxury items of the year, right? And plus, I have the luxury of also having rental income, so it's pretty easy to feel fairly insulated against any short-term market fluctuations, right? And even though I'm already in the retire early part of my life, I still do dedicate a good portion of my portfolio for these dividend growth stocks, or aka dividend aristocrats, right? After all, what's the worst case if I generate too much income via dividends in the future, right? Well, I can always just reinvest them back into the market, right? So to me, dividends are not definitely not bad, right? They may not be optimal for those of us who are like really anal retentive, right? But for somebody who's lazy and wants to do very little on managing my money, they serve their purpose very well, acting like essentially rental income, like very steady income generators, but with less hassle. So basically what I'm saying is, hedge your bets, right? You don't have to always think of dividends as either incredibly bad or incredibly awesome, right? It's not so black and white. There are reasonable points on both sides of this argument. Just invest for the long term and be patient, honestly, and it'll all work out. Cheers. I'll approach it.